What's up, everybody? Welcome to Christianly. This is your host, Brad Andrews. Thanks for joining us. So last week we launched Christianly, and if you've listened to the very first podcast, I want to just say thank you. Some of you have already subscribed to our YouTube channel. You followed us on X and Instagram, and I'm very thankful for that. I want to say a special thanks to a couple of friends behind the scenes that have really made this happen. Tyler Robbins, Russell Hammond, thank you, men. You have helped get this off the ground, and I am supremely grateful for all that you've done. Now, as we said last week, if you're hungry for clear and joyful thinking, for a kind of thick Christianity, for unapologetic truth under Christ's crown, this is the place for you. And if you caught our first episode, you'll know that I read a very long quote from A.W. Tozer from his book of Gods and Men, and that quote captured me about a year ago. And really, in a lot of ways, it provoked me to start this podcast. And if I were to sum up that long quote, it would be this one line from it. Tozer said, 100 years from now, historians will know what was taking place religiously in this year of our Lord. But that will be too late for us. We should know right now. See, Tozer is reminding us that the church does not get the luxury of hindsight while history is being written. We don't get to outsource our discernment. We don't get to wait for footnotes and timelines and biographies to tell us whether we're faithful. God has placed us here in this moment with this responsibility. And the truth is that one day, textbooks will diagnose our spiritual condition with precision. But by then, our children will already be living with the consequences of either our courage or our cowardice. And much of what I have in mind as I approach this podcast in many ways has to do with my children and their children and their children's children. Like, what kind of world will we leave them? So in order to leave them something better than excuses and apologies, the call for us today in this podcast, I pray, is to be awake, to be faithful to the call that God has given us to contend for the faith in this generation so that our children don't have to rediscover it in ruins in their own. So as we said last week, here is the plan. We're going to look at 3 things together each week, one issue for a little bit longer, about 15 minutes, and sandwiched around that, we'll look at 2 other issues that will be shorter in length. And the goal is to keep this really tight around 30 minutes or so that every episode is focused and digestible and it's worth your time. So let's get started.
White evangelical Christianity is a cancer. These are the worst of our country.
So I came across a couple of clips in the past couple of weeks from the same political podcast, a popular one on the left politically called iHip News. And this podcast is hosted by Jennifer Welch and Angie Sullivan, who both happen to be from my home state of Oklahoma. And these women are not anonymous trolls. They're not fringe activists. These are legit cultural influencers with big platforms who share narratives and in a lot of ways help determine what is considered respectable opinion in polite society. In other words, you can watch clips like these and think they don't have much impact, but their words actually do travel. Their contempt gets normalized, and when they speak this way, which I'm going to share with you here in just a moment, about Christians, they're not just venting. They're catechizing an audience in how to think about the church. Now, the first clip that I saw was just Welch and Sullivan, and they're talking together, but the quote that made the rounds was this: white evangelical Christianity is a cancer. This is the worst in our country. These are the worst people in our country because they use their religion in 2 ways, as a weapon and as a shield. In the second clip that I saw from the same podcast, Welch is interviewing former CNN newscaster and now podcaster Don Lemon, who we actually talked about last week. Remember, he was a part of a group that invaded City's Church, an evangelical church in St. Paul, Minnesota last month. And though Lemon has tried to distance himself from that incident by saying he was just documenting it, there's plenty of evidence that implicates him as an active participant in the effort. But that being said, Lemon says in this clip this: I think they're entitled, speaking of the people at this church, and that entitlement comes from a supremacy, a white supremacy, and they think this country was built for them. So listen to those quotes again. White evangelical Christianity is a cancer, and they're entitled white supremacists. I just need to ask, what in the world is white Christianity? Friends, that is a propaganda term from my perspective. It's a slur that is masquerading as analysis. It's a lazy attempt to take the gospel, which transcends tribe and tongue and nation, and staple it to race so that it can be morally disqualified without a debate. It is projection, a red herring, and a straw man all in one neat little package. Take something good, attach white to it, and call it toxic. That is the playbook. And Sullivan and Lemon are running it perfectly. They're not analyzing reality. They are trying to manufacture a villain. They are taking ordinary Christians, moms and dads and teenagers and children, hymn singers and Bible readers, faithful church members, trying to raise their families in the fear of the Lord and recasting them as moral monsters so that they must be opposed. Friends, that's not journalism. That's not courage. It is narrative warfare. It's the deliberate reshaping of public perception so that faithfulness looks dangerous and obedience looks extremist. And I believe that once that kind of lie takes root, and it is taking root, almost anything can become justifiable. When you convince a culture that the church is a cancer, you have already begun arguing that it must be cut out. Lemon in particular is playing the role of the high priest in this moral panic. He's anointing ordinary believers as villains and giving cultural permission to treat them as enemies. He is acting as the town crier for a secular inquisition, ringing the bell and pointing at the next target. Call worshipers white supremacists long enough, and eventually people will believe it, or at least tolerate what comes next. History teaches this lesson relentlessly. First they mock, then they malign, and then they marginalize, and finally they criminalize. And that may seem extreme, but a lot of Christians look at situations like this and still think this is about politics. And I don't think it is. It's about authority and power and who gets to define good and evil, who gets to say what is true, who gets to name reality. Psalm 2 already tells us that the kings of this earth set themselves against the Lord and against his anointed. So this isn't new. It really is an old rebellion in new packaging, but the mask is off now. So remember that these are not anonymous trolls or fringe activists. Again, these are cultural influencers with platforms who shape narratives. They really do help determine what is considered the kinds of opinions you should have. In other words, their words travel. And when they speak this way about Christians, you and me, they are trying to frame and form an audience and what to think about us. So what do we do? First, we need to stop being surprised because on the one hand, much of this hostility exists because we've spent a very long time trying to be liked instead of being faithful. We've traded boldness for branding. We've traded conviction for credentials and courage for conference invites. In a lot of ways, we've wanted something like cultural approval, and in the end, all we've really gotten is cultural contempt. But on the other hand, I would say Jesus promised us this. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Normal Christianity has always been opposed Christianity, and I would argue we are not persecuted because there's nothing worth persecuting us for. Next, I would say that we need to really remember that the gospel isn't hate speech. God's word does not need rebranding. Christ is not running for office. And so we need to prepare accordingly for what is to come. When people publicly fantasize about or call us cancer on our side of the aisle, we need to take them seriously. Nehemiah prayed and posted guards, and that wasn't paranoia, that was wisdom. And he was holding the line, and we need to hold the line as well, maybe even legally and morally if we need to. If activists violate our constitutional rights, they owe immediate, unequivocal apologies. Absent that, consequences should follow. Romans 13 exists for a reason. But lastly, I would want to say we need to remember who we are. We are not victims. We are witnesses. So we don't need to panic. We just need to persevere with the Lord's help, but only if we stop pretending that this is merely a misunderstanding and start treating it like it is a spiritual war. Now for our deep dive. I want to talk about the story that came out last week regarding the case of Fox Varian. It is absolutely one of the most chilling and consequential stories that's emerged from this ongoing cultural and medical experiment masquerading as care for those confused by their genders as youth. A 16-year-old girl, Fox, was pressured into a double mastectomy, only later to decide to detransition, and she sued for $2 million in damages. And when she did that, she won. And she is really, in a lot of ways, the tip of an iceberg that is finally showing its full, grotesque bulk. Her story exposes a medical industrial complex that has been running wild. This network of clinicians and ideologues and cultural elites who've, in a lot of ways, all conspired knowingly or not to treat vulnerable children like lab rats in an experiment with irreversible consequences. In fact, Varian's mother testified that she had opposed the surgery but was bullied into agreement by the threat that if her daughter did not transition, she might commit suicide. And that right there is the pivot point of a lot of this scandal. Coercion disguised as consent. Fear masquerading as science and ideology dressed as medicine. Psalm 11:3 reminds us that if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? We are staring at precisely that, a destruction of the moral and ethical foundations that ought to guide medicine and parenting and public discourse. And as the floodgates are going to begin to open, I believe here, more detransitioners are coming forward, suing the clinicians who subjected them to these medical experiments. And yet, these gender identity activists continue to insist that regret is rare, that clinicians know exactly what they're doing, that these surgeries, these cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers are proven to help, and to deny this intervention, it risks things like suicide. And these words from these people are not just exaggerations. They are lies that have been repeated so relentlessly that their audience assumes that it equals truth. British doctor Leighton Seal admitted at the 2021 WPATH conference this. He said, "We are doing procedures here where we don't have outcome data." That's startling to me. So this is not, though, either an isolated misstatement. This is a statement from a professional on the record admitting that the lives of minors are being manipulated in the dark without a shred of longitudinal evidence to support the efficacy or the safety of these interventions. It is improvisation with flesh and with hormones, with lifelong consequences, and it's all conducted under the auspices of authority. And in short, they're playing God. Now, to me, with Varian being the first legally recognized case like this, I believe it has massive implications. There will be more to come forward. And I say, let the reckoning begin. Because this was enabled by a broader cultural apparatus, journalists and academics and politicians and publishers and medical professionals who promoted an ideology over reason and evidence. And they did not just fail to ask questions, they silenced them. Anyone who dared to raise cautionary voices was labeled a bigot. They were shamed and they were marginalized. Now, again, this shouldn't be any surprise to us as Christians. Proverbs 29 reminds us that if a ruler listens to lies, all his officials become wicked. And we see that same principle at work here. When elites buy the narrative without skepticism, they poison the environment for sound decision-making and ethical practice. Consider the broader cultural dynamics. These activists and elites were not neutral. They were zealots whose mission was ideological. They did not advocate restraint, which they should have, because restraint does not earn applause or cultural cachet. The young people they claimed to champion were treated as pawns for attention and for influence. They weaponized trauma and they promised salvation through surgical intervention, and they weaponized parents against their own kids. The most appalling part is this to me. These acts were celebrated by professionals who, if pressed, would claim they were protecting youth. But it was, in fact, a sophisticated mechanism for social and cultural enforcement, using the veneer of medical expertise to suppress questioning and manipulate consent. The command for medical professionals is to do no harm. The oath is supposed to guide medical ethics, but it was replaced by ideology. And that was not a mistake. These were breaches of trust so severe they would shock our ancestors. But culpability does not stop at the clinic doors. As I've said already, publishers and academics, journalists, celebrities, even politicians have played their part. They cheered this on. They called skeptics names. They treated evidence of harm as inconvenient noise. They championed a kind of thinking over reason and celebrated this as dogma. And they bullied parents, they marginalized dissenters, and the environment was so hostile that Varian's mother felt she had no choice but to consent. That is collective malpractice, both on a cultural level and a moral level, and the consequences that resulted will be measured not only in dollars, but in ruined lives. So here's what's clear to me. Parents, you must regain the authority over your children that the culture has attempted to usurp. You are not powerless, and no ideology grants anyone the right to coerce consent. The medical establishment must be held accountable. Regulators and courts and professional boards must recognize that winging it with hormones and surgery is not science, which is one of the ways that the professionals have described this. And then I would say this, the public must understand the role of cultural elites in this catastrophe. Again, these are not neutral arbiters of the truth. They are enablers. They're cheerleaders for things that have hurt vulnerable youth. And let's not forget the spiritual dimension as well. Isaiah 5:20 warns us, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." See, that is precisely what we've seen in this story. A complex mix of trauma and confusion and developmental vulnerability that's been labeled a problem of identity. It's resulted in irreversible physical interventions. Meanwhile, anyone who counsels caution with this has been demonized. So all of this has not just been a failure of science, it's been a failure of conscience. And the coming wave of detransition lawsuits is only the beginning. The court of public opinion, I pray, is going to turn the tide here. It's historically been very slow to understand these sort of nuanced medical and ethical issues, but I think they will eventually reckon with the scale of harm. But legal remedies, while they're necessary, are not sufficient. Society must rebuild moral and intellectual rigor as well. They must resist stuff like this, these fads that demand conformity over reason. And they must restore a culture in which questions can be asked without fear of social or professional retribution. And by calling out the clinicians and the enablers and the ideologues with this, my hope is that we can prevent similar catastrophes in the future. The damage is real. the victims are real, and the responsibility extends beyond the walls of clinics to the highest cultural platforms. We are living through a moment that will be judged harshly by history, but we can make it right. Proverbs 4 reminds us that wisdom is the principal thing, and to get it is to get understanding. Now, this is the kind of wisdom we're going to have to pursue if we hope to protect kids from ideology that masquerades as care. Varian's lawsuit is more than a legal precedent. I think it's a moral alarm for us all. It is a reminder that when that kind of thinking supplants evidence, and when applause replaces the conscience, the vulnerable suffer the most. And it is a warning to every parent, to every medical professional, every journalist, every influencer, that history will not forget, and God will not overlook the choices we make in moments like this. This scandal is ours to witness, ours to understand, and it's ours to act upon. Only then can we hope to prevent it from repeating and to honor the lives of those who were betrayed. Well, if you watched either of the Super Bowl halftime shows this year, you didn't just see music. You saw a collision of worldviews. Both stages were battlegrounds for competing visions of identity and belonging and what America means in a fracturing society. Now, to put my cards on the table, I watched neither. I was actually at a youth group Super Bowl party, and we watched the Puppy Bowl at halftime, but I have seen all that I need to after the fact, clips and commentary, etc., to help me understand something that is truer than it's ever been. It is no longer possible to separate art from the questions a society is wrestling with. Questions about language and power and belonging and history. Really, what is the soul of a people is what art is telling us today. Now, on one side, you had Bad Bunny representing the NFL's increasingly multicultural, identity-driven brand. And in that show, you saw multiculturalism, globalism celebrated, personal freedom celebrated. But on the other, you found the TPUSA-backed halftime show headlined by Kid Rock. And that show preached through guitar riffs and patriotic bravado with an America and Christianity first worldview. Now, for both of these shows, at first glance, it might read like politics in pyrotechnics, a clash of liberal and conservative culture. And in many ways, it is no less than that. But if we scratch beneath the glitter, what played out in these shows was an inbreaking into our time and space of the spiritual battle that Paul talks about in Ephesians 6. He says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness as in high places." In other words, sometimes what is happening in the heavenlies breaks into history. So let me explain that. Bad Bunny's performance was an unabashed celebration of hedonistic freedom and sexual expression. You've probably seen some Christian commentators say that it was just art, like harmless expression, even a celebration of multiculturalism. And though you might be able to find some of that in the mix, but make no mistake, every visual, every lyric, every manufactured spectacle of the NFL's halftime show was a drumbeat echoing the adversary's ancient strategy: draw worship away from God and normalize rebellion. Look, the show was electric. It was flashy. It was intoxicating, because that's how the enemy works. He never approaches in obvious ways. He dresses himself in lights and art and the allure of what feels progressive and inclusive, trying to convince us that it's okay to celebrate liberation, when in reality, we are actually partaking in spiritual captivity. Now, TPUSA's show, by contrast, was a unapologetically cultural and spiritual counterstrike to the NFL's halftime show. And while it lacked the slick production of the NFL machine, it had a different kind of energy, had the kind that cannot be bought or packaged or commodified. It was not the kind that could be filtered like the NFL's halftime show was. It was unashamedly aligned with another kingdom. And it's not perfect. TPUSA, Kid Rock, I can't vouch for everything that they have ever done or said. But make no mistake, this wasn't entertainment versus entertainment. What you were seeing there is a spiritual warfare playing out on the cultural plane. On the one side, the NFL's halftime spectacle was a masterclass in seduction. Every moment was engineered to captivate and to make you think it's harmless fun, but beneath the lights and the hype was a carefully staged message. So, Christian, you need to keep your eyes open and your conscience clear in these moments, because what looks like an innocent performance is often a carefully staged battlefield. What the NFL sold as entertainment was at its core a spiritual compromise, attempting to draw millions into a worldview that exalts self and pleasure and rebellion under the guise, again, of liberty, while masking the enemy's hand in plain sight. In other words, what may seem like just a show could be, and was in this case, a war for your soul. Hey, thanks for joining us again. Make sure to like and follow and subscribe on your favorite platforms so you don't miss an episode. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube, our channel there. Our socials on X, ChristianLee_pod. On Instagram, it's just one word, ChristianLeePod. And remember, don't just listen to the podcast. Speak and lead. Share the light with others. Remember, there isn't a corner of this world that doesn't belong to the King.